Hello, everyone, and welcome to our IT Governance Turkey's webinar. Thank you all for patience as well. We passed 10 minutes our webinar due to the inconveniences of the moving from BlueJeans to this application. And I'm pretty sure the conflict is still going on, so we will try to move other attendees to this webinar link as well. Thank you for your patience. We are not planning to wait for a long, just 5 more minutes. Again, thank you.
Yeah.
For small informations that I'm going to give, there's a question. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Keller. Yeah, it was going to be 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but due to that inconvenience and the technical issue, we moved here, and 15 minutes delay that we are foreseeing right now. You can write your questions into the question area. We will ask Mr. Clark at the end of the presentation. And you can feel free to write any comments on the chat as well.
But they have to be good comments. Like, we're having a good time. This is a great webinar. We're learning a lot of good stuff. And they have to be easy questions too, because hard questions are more difficult to get answers to.
And difficult are forbidden.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go with that. I like that.
Those bad comments. Do we need last call for BlueJeans?
Yeah, okay. All right, 1 minute to go. All right. Can take in?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
We can start.
We can start. It is 8:15 and yeah, 1 p.m. 1:15 p.m. All right. So hello everyone and welcome to our IT Governance Turkey's another webinar. We have a special guest today, almost a quarter century experienced Mr. Clark here with us. We will talk about the Agile Auditing today, and thank you for being with us. And again, sorry for the inconvenience about the Blue Jeans. So, John Tekin, would you like to say something?
Yeah, hi to all. Thank you so much for your kind attendance. And maybe we can introduce briefly, Kerem, if you want, our community.
Sure. IT Governance Turkey is a very young community, not even NGO. We are young shots, would like to improve the governance awareness in the Turkey. And we are talking about the GRC competence as well. And we would like to follow up the international applications and the future of this profession. So you are all welcome to follow us on the LinkedIn and as well as the itgovernanceturkey.com.
Yes, also as like Kerem mentioned, we have founded a voluntary non-profit organization, IT Governance Turkey, that's aim for continuous development through information sharing. We translate foreign resource, organized events and trainings. Our aim to spread the philosophy of learn, develop, and share. If you have the same patience, you can follow us, IT Governance Turkey. Thank you so much.
So, Mr. Clark, we are ready to listen your presentation, and please feel free to ask questions on the question box as well, our audience, and thank you. Stage is yours, Mr. Clark.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And thank you all for your patience this morning. This is a true pleasure for me. It's been a long time since I've been to Turkey. My wife and I were in Istanbul several years ago. I apologize for not speaking in the native language, but thank you for all understanding English and for inviting me to share some ideas with you about the future of audit. And we're going to talk about that through the applying Agile principles to internal audit. I do want to say that one of the things about Agile auditing, and it's different for you IT specialists out there, you're very familiar with what Agile is. You've been using that for several years in information technology as a process that helps facilitate the easy and quick implementation of software systems, etc. What you're going to hear today is a little bit different from an audit perspective. And for the auditors out there, it's important to realize that we don't have yet a defined, consistent definition of what Agile really is. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is a concept of Agile auditing that's based on risk-based auditing, and it starts moving a traditional look of audit to the future. And quite frankly, from all the people that I've been talking to lately and within the industry, if we're not risk-based today, we're already kind of behind. So we probably ought to be moving and thinking about risk-based auditing, which includes the GRC methodologies and a whole lot of other stuff. Agile is going to be more of an approach to what we do than a methodology. And that's how I'm kind of getting my hands around it myself. So hopefully we'll learn something today. Feel free to ask questions, jot them down in the question and answer area. We will answer them as I see them. Certainly we'll answer them at the end. And also, if you think of something afterwards, I will have my contact information available. Please reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn, or reach out to me and chat with me about what your thoughts are. I love talking about Agile auditing. I love talking about the audit profession. I love talking about risk management. So hopefully something's good. I know it's dinner time in Turkey, so grab your goblet of wine, sit back and relax, and let's just go through this and see what we have to say today. This should be interesting. I think I'll start off with just a simple statement. The main difference between Agile auditing and traditional auditing simply is flexibility. We can use any kind of words that we would like to use, but we don't really have to use those words, because ultimately, we as auditors have certain standards we have to adhere to when we do our work. What Agile methodology or Agile process allows us is some flexibility, and I'm going to show you how some of that flexibility can apply. And why is this important? It's important because if you want your audit profession as a group, as an audit team, or as an auditor individually, to be relevant and to remain vibrant and viable to your organizations and to your own career, you have to become less traditional, more flexible, more risk-based, and more agile. It's going to be very important for us to do that, for us to maintain a sense of trust, ownership, and responsibility as professional auditors. We're not saying abandon tradition, absolutely not, because tradition is good. It gives us a solid base, but we're going to talk about how we can be more flexible and make sure that we adhere to the standards of auditing, as well as be responsive to what's going on in the marketplace. I hope everybody is staying safe during the COVID times, and some of the things we'll talk about will help us in our remote auditing mode, because it's very important. So let's start talking a little bit about a traditional look. Traditional look, a couple of the highlights that I share with you today is that I audited 2 years ago, so I have to audit it in third quarter this year. That gets to the annual planning. And when auditors create a auditable universe that they share with the board of directors, with the audit committees, or with the government, they always want to make sure that this is what we looked at before, this is what we're going to look at this year, this is what we plan on looking at next year, the year after, or maybe 3 years from now. So everything that's in their universe gets looked at at a certain point in time. On the baseline, there's nothing wrong with that, but that is very traditional. I have to complete Sarbanes-Oxley testing by Friday. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley testing in the United States is a regulatory requirement for institutions from a financial perspective. I think internationally in Europe, the FSA has something similar. I'm not sure in Turkey and the rest of the Middle East what rules they have, but there are state regulations of what auditors need to do. This is kind of a traditional work. This is traditionally what auditors have done. Accounting responsibilities for financial reporting, regulatory compliance with the state and federal governmental regulators, those are things that are very traditional, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's certainly, we still need to do that. But we'll talk about how we become agile in what we do as we go forward. Another thing that traditional auditors often will do is, I'm busy writing my issues for the audit report. You know, it's a simple statement, but people tend to do that. They'll go through an audit, they'll have a finding, they'll discuss the finding with the business, they'll confirm that it is a finding, they'll make it an exception, they'll write it as an issue, they'll share it with the business, they'll put it in the report, and it ends up being tracked until resolution. That is a traditional audit approach. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. The question I would have for everybody that's participating with us today, is that the best and most effective and relevant approach to auditing in today's environment? And there's a lot we can learn from technology, because technology is so fast-paced and audit tends to be slower paced. And when you look at the two, and I did look at the two, I'm not an auditor by birth. I worked at Citigroup for many, many years, and I was in risk management, credit risk management, and operations before I got into audit. But when I got into audit and I noticed the difference in the pacing, I was used to such a faster pace in what we did that it was hard for me to adjust to the traditional very methodological approach to what auditors did. And they had reason for doing that. The technology is too fast for me. You guys are brilliant. You're smart. You catch on to stuff much quicker than I can. As Karim said, I'm a half a century old. I was here when cars were new. I'm teasing. I was here. I'm not that old, but I get the technology is so fast paced. I will tell you a secret. I use my cell phone for making phone calls. All of you guys who are younger generation, you use it for everything in the earth. I mean, everything you guys use it for, I use to make a phone call. So there is a difference, but I will tell you that I love technology and I love the pace. Audit needs to accelerate a little bit from the traditional pace that we've had before, and that's where agile and risk-based kinds of helps us. So this is definitely some of the traditional commentary or observations we would have. Let's take a look at some of the flexible or agile comments that we would make. Instead of what we had said before, now I would say, based on this information, I think we should focus on this right now. It kind of gives me the idea of, gee, I've been going along, I found something out. Maybe I don't need to do what I was planning on doing. Maybe I need to switch and work on this, because this seems to be a bigger problem and maybe a larger problem that we need to address. Being flexible, I'm not sticking to my plan, but I'm making a change. Another comment, I'm in the mood for better understanding the new onboarding process for credit card customers. Now I use this as an example from someone who I talked to that understands agile or flexible. And what this indicates is that we may not always need to do a formal audit to understand that which we need to understand. And that's where flexibility comes in as well. Traditional audit has always said, I need a formal process to do my audit work. But traditional audit is modifying that approach. And risk-based audit and flexible agile auditing, you don't need a formal audit process to do audit work. Consultative work is audit work. The Institute of Internal Auditors, the standards, allow for auditors to consult and to assure. That's two different things we do. And there's nothing wrong with doing both of those. We may not have the skills for that, but our team may have the skills for that. So this is one of those examples of where flexible and agile actually mean the same thing. Another comment, just finished discussing some potential issues with management, need to document the action plan we agreed to in the work papers. What does this imply? And this is a radical thought, and it will be for a lot of the traditional auditors that are participating with us today. The thought is, all exceptions don't have to be reported issues in an audit report. Really simple statement. There's a lot of things that we talk to our clients about that we don't need to put into a report. As auditors, we need to document them somewhere, but there's no standard that says every exception needs to be audited in a report or placed in a report. And there's nothing that says that everything needs to be an exception that is reportable or an issue that needs to be resolved. In fact, one of the things that happens with agile flexible auditing is that the conversations we have with management about things that they may want to consider often have much stronger impact than an audit report that ends up criticizing by rating or criticism a process within an organization. A lot more positive results occur from a discussion than from a report. And I do webinars on risk-based auditing and writing and all sorts of other things that you can see how things really change as we as auditors change our approach to be more business-like, more consultative, more provide assurance when we need to, but we don't always need to provide assurance. And that's what the value of agile audit thinking or methodology will provide us, is the ability to be flexible and to use all of the skills that we have to add value to our organizations. So this is a little bit flexible. The previous one was traditional. There is a difference, and it's a mentality difference. It's a mental difference. It's how I approach my job. It's not how I necessarily do my job, but it's how I approach it. And how we approach things makes a huge difference in the results and the long-term relationships we have. And I will tell you this from experience, that to be relevant in today's environment with the fast pace that businesses are dealing with, we have to be flexible and we have to be as fast-paced as they are, or we become irrelevant to them. And they will let us do our regulatory compliance auditing. They'll let us do our financial auditing, but we will miss the big risk in the organization. We will miss the opportunity to contribute to the strategic initiatives of our organization, and we will miss the opportunity to have careers that are challenging and contributory to the organizations that we work for. So that's some of the things that we want to think about as we go forward and try to define for ourselves what agile auditing looks like. A couple questions that I want to throw out to you, just kind of like a checklist. And this is something that I shared with Galvanize. We kind of came up together. Galvanize is a company that does software. They are my sponsor for a lot of my webinars. You'll see their contact info as well. But we did a Agile Audit webinar not too long ago. I think it was a couple months ago when we came together and created some of this information. I wanted to share this checklist with you because I think it makes a lot of sense. First of all, are you taking a risk-based approach to audit? Before you can even think about agile auditing, and agile auditing is more than changing a scope or reducing your time or changing your audit plan, okay? That's not agility. So get that out of your mind. That's not agility. Agility is something else, and we'll get there. But a question to ask, are you taking a risk-based approach to audit? If you're not taking a risk-based approach to audit, you are not ready for agile auditing. So before you get to agility, you need to be risk-based, and risk-based is different than traditional in that it allows you to focus on what is really providing more risk to the organization, even though something traditionally you have looked at for years. Another question to ask ourselves, are you using data to drive auditing? Data is extremely important. And there's a lot of rules and management and risk around data, but in audit, we should be using data to drive our auditing. It shouldn't be an add-on, it should be the driver. Do you know how to become a trusted advisor? And I put that, I don't know why I have the word become a trusted advisor twice in there. Wrong. But anyway, a trusted advisor provides advice. It does not provide a rating like pass, fail, or satisfactory, needs improvement. It doesn't provide a critique. It provides advice. And there is a subtle difference, and sometimes not so subtle, difference between advice and critique. And we as auditors have every right when we are auditing to be critical. As advisors, we have every right to be human and to be humane. And once we master the ability to be humane as an advisor, we become more human as auditors. And the value of that for us as auditors and audit professionals is that we then become more trusted. And the more trusted we become, the better we are positioned to provide value. And the last question we would ask, are you providing insight to your clients? And the insight comes from experience, either your own or somebody else's. Insight is not you're doing it wrong, you need to fix it. Insight is, did you know there might be a better way to do this task that will bring you better results, is less risky, and probably provides you a more cost-effective solution? That's what an insight sounds like, not a critique. It is opinion based on experience. And that's where auditors can make a difference for themselves and for their teams. Okay, so that's a little bit about background. Let's go right into the 4 principles internal auditors can borrow from Agile and see how we can add those to what we're doing. Now, I've got some quotes here, and unfortunately, most of them, all of them are from Western influence. Obviously, I live in the United States. I was born in Germany. I have a lot of friends in Europe. I would like to have more insights from the Middle East, from Asia, from Latin America, where I spent 17 years working. But some of the quotes that I have are good quotes that apply to what we're talking about. So I'm going to use those, and I apologize that they're all Western centric. Next time, if I'm invited back, we'll have more Middle Eastern centric, and we'll get some more things that are more relatable. The first principle, though, is a people-driven insight, and we've talked a little bit about insight and people-driven insight. And the quote that I'm using here is, "A moment's insight is something worth a life's experience." Insight, I-N-S-I-G-H-T, is different than insight, I-N-C-I-T-E. A lot of times, auditors I-N-C-I-T-E reactions instead of providing insight as spelled here. And the difference is that people with insight focused on humanity and making sure that it is a process issue, not a people issue, get along a lot. They get further along in their careers by providing that insight. If you don't have the experience, and a lot of you are young and you're just starting out in your careers, or you may only been there for 4 or 5 years, you will have experience. If you don't have it, seek it out from other people who've already had it. One of the things I wrote a book called Dare to Be Different, An Auditor's Personal Guide to Excellence. It's out on Amazon. One of the things I talk about there is that I always have a group of experts that I can refer to and call up on and talk with for those areas that I don't know. They have experiences where I don't have experiences. Somebody knows private banking, somebody knows technology better than I do, somebody knows treasury management better than I do. If I need to learn something, these experts help me learn, and they provide insight to me, which I can then relay on to other people. So if you're young and you don't have that expertise yet, you will have it. I can guarantee you that. But don't wait to get it. Find some experts, ask them to be on your board of directors, or your personal board of directors, and rely on them to give you expert advice from time to time. That will be very helpful for you, and that will help you provide people-driven insight to your clients. That is how we take the Agile technology process and adapt it to an audit process. Now, I will tell you this, even for us traditional auditors that are out there, nothing wrong with this. This aligns perfectly with tradition. We should be providing insight, not just checking the boxes. You also want to apply the right audit tool to the situation because it demonstrates audit expertise and ability to utilize insightful decision making. For example, you don't always need to write an audit report. You don't always need to write a report and put a rating on it. You don't need to always criticize something the same way. And you don't need to always not give a balanced approach to the audit committee. Now, I'm not saying the traditional audit didn't do that. I'm just saying we didn't do it very well. And I was kind of introduced to audit the traditional way. And I quickly moved away from that. And I moved away because it's my personality, not because it was wrong. It's just wrong for me. And it's still wrong for me, to be totally transparent, because I realized that risk-based auditing and agile mental approach is the approach that will get people to listen to what I have to say. A greater responsibility for me as an auditor, but really a wonderful opportunity to share influence. So principle number one, let's go to principle number two, client collaboration. Now this is interesting, and here I have a actual fashion designer who gave us a quote. The whole point of collaboration is that you give and take from each other, and that's how you create things that are new. And I love that quote because it is so real. One of the challenges that we as auditors have had, and for you technology people that are kind of sitting there, you're probably shaking your head, yeah, you have had this problem, you don't like to collaborate. Well, part of the reason is that we have a rule that we have to be independent. And a lot of people interpret that rule very differently. I look at the rule this way. Independence is not an org chart situation. It is not where I sit in the hierarchy of the organization. Independence is a mental approach. It is a character issue. I can be independent. I can collaborate, i.e., I can share things with one another and learn from that and still be independent. In fact, it makes me more independent the more I know. So I'm going to encourage you to not forget about independence, but remember that independence does not mean audit isolation. Independence, isolation, two different words, two different roots. They may even come from two different bases, but they don't mean the same thing. And yet audit has often traditionally interpreted that way. We often sit by ourselves. We don't have lunch with too many people in the business. There's a lot of things we do to make sure we don't tell people things. We don't share information till the report is published. That's not being independent. Independent is having the ability to make an unfettered decision or have an opinion that is not mired down by prejudice, bias, or undue influence. That's what independence is. That's what auditors should be. Bringing teams together to resolve cross-functional issues is a valuable trait and skill set that auditors need to have to be really addressing agile principles. You want to collaborate, not be outside looking in. You want to help management get to a position, not tell them why they didn't get there. Just a little bit different perspective of what we do. Let's go on to principle number three. We used to say not in scope. We want to now respond to change. And I have a couple of things. A singer-songwriter, Dolly Parton, said, we cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust the sails. I really like that because, one, I really like music to begin with, but I like the way that that captures. You really can't control some things, but we certainly can allow ourselves to be buffeted one way or the other. And Richard Branson, who I think we probably all know, every success story is a tale of contract adaptation, revision, and change. We are in a world of change. We've noticed with COVID, we've had change, and I know Turkey's gone through a lot of change over the last few years, politically, socially, as the United States and Europe is going through. Asia seems to be a little more settled on those fronts. Latin America has a lot of the social and economical, educational change that's going on as well. Change is always going to be there. Traditional audit typically doesn't facilitate and make change easy. We can make it easy, and this really helps us. So we want to make sure that we are agile, and agility means that we can rapidly redeploy our resources as we go forward. We don't have to have them in one audit just because the plan says I'm going to be doing this for 20 weeks. I can actually redeploy them. This is a practical application of responding to change. Communication is going to be different because as we see something come along, we're going to make sure that we move along and change that as well. And documentation is different because we're going to be documenting our decisions that we make, not necessarily all of the work that we do. And we have to make sure that as auditors, we do document exactly why we do what we do. And there's a lot more value in that than just documenting this is what we did. All right, let's look at the fourth one, and this is the last principle. Flexibility does not necessarily mean you do something different, but that you do the same thing differently. That's an interesting quote. Flexibility is important for us, especially when we're doing agile methodology. And there are three basic keys to that. One is the mental approach, and we've talked a little bit about that. The mental approach is a big deal, and it's a big deal because how we approach something mentally allows us to develop the process and procedures to go forward. If we are traditional by nature, we may not have a very flexible approach that will be required of us to be successful as we move forward. The procedural approach, on the other hand, can be flexible based on our mental approach. And finally, the personal approach, which is how does Dan Clark deal with people? That is the third approach. If we, as an individual, are not flexible in our thinking, our adaptability, and how we approach things personally, our process cannot be that way either. So these four principles are things that need to be considered, and it's a very light touch on Agile auditing. And the reason I did a light touch is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, we really haven't defined what Agile auditing looks like. We are evolving. We pretty much know what risk-based looks like. And we've said, if you're not risk-based auditing, you're not ready for Agile. But if you want to be agile in what you do, we've given you four principles that will help you get there, that will strengthen a risk-based audit approach. In fact, the principles will strengthen your relationship with your clients and allow you to be much more flexible and more meaningful to them and be more impactful in what you share with them. So what does it look like in practice? Let me give you quick examples here. This is the traditional approach to an audit universe. You have auditable entities: accounts payable, receivable, interest rate management, liquidity risk management, capital management. Because you have that kind of universe, you have to audit those things every 2 or 3 years. That's the traditional approach. I have X number of entities. I'm going to audit them over a 5-year period or 3-year period, X number of times, because they're rated high, medium, or low. Let's look at the Agile approach, how we approach. All of those entities are now one entity, and that entity is called financial risk management. And if you can visualize financial risk management, every one of those auditable entities to the left are financial risk management. What this universe does allow me to do is, during my annual planning, I can pick out what risk within financial risk management I want to look at this year. And I can have a methodology that tells me these are what's the most important things I need to focus on. And this year it may be liquidity risk management and capital management. I may not look at accounts payable, receivable, or financial controls. I kind of have to look at financial controls, but I may not look at payroll or incentive programs because they don't have as much risk to me as they did before. If you design your universe differently and make it more meaningful from a higher level of perspective, you end up with more flexibility in what you're going to audit throughout the year. That is what Agile allows you to do. Let's look at another thing. This is the finding process. We observe an exception, we write a finding, we discuss a written finding with business, we adjust the finding, review the finding, issue the finding, receive a response, update the finding, revisit adjusted finding with client, finalize the finding, and we publish the finding in our report. That's your traditional report. Work intensive, typical what we do. All of you who are auditors should be nodding your head. Yeah, that's exactly what we do. The Agile approach, real simple. We observe an exception. We discuss the exception with client. We collaboratively determine impact and solution. And we note the resolution in the audit work paper. Doesn't necessarily have to be in a report. We have the flexibility to do that if we need to, but we can also have the flexibility to, in talking with business, to determine the impact and solution. It's not just to justify our finding, it's to actually talk about, is it important? Does it have impact? How do we resolve it? And what do we do with business to make sure that our concern is addressed? We don't have to put it in a report, but you still can. This one happened to go into the work paper. So those are two examples of how Agile approach is applied. You can't get there if you're not risk-based. The universe one that we talked about was, and I'll go back, this one is very risk-based because it allows you to really focus on the risk of each area. What we did in financial services with financial risk management, credit risk management, operational risk management, technological risk management, everything was based on a risk category or family, and then we would design our universe that way. Every year, our audit plan was different, but the audit committee got the same focus because we were focused on risk associated with that. So how do we start applying this today? I would just encourage you to remember that Agile auditing is more than changing scope or reducing time on a specific task or even reprioritizing what comes next. It is a mental approach, it is a process approach, it is a personal approach. It's how we think about what we do, and it's utilizing all of the tools that auditors have in their relationship with their client. And it moves us from being overly critical to being collaboratively constructive. And I think there's so much more value in that. I think you will find, in fact, I know you will find from your clients that people are going to be much more receptive to a collaborative, constructive approach than they are to the traditional critical approach that we've had. So, 5 ways to apply Agile and how we work. Design your audit universe differently, and we talked a little bit about that. Align risk assessments, and now we have risk profiling, which is a little different than assessments, and that's something we can talk about too, to Agile audit processes. Realize that processes may not be appropriate for every team or every audit universe, and that's okay. We talked about regulatory compliance auditing. Agile may not be good for that. If that's all you do, this may not be good for you from an audit perspective, but it would be very good from you from a personal perspective and a mental perspective. Improve documentation of decision rationale in work papers. Why you make a decision that this is an exception versus this is a reportable finding versus an exception, or however you want to term that, document that rationale. When people argue other people's rationale, it's because they don't see it or understand it. If we document why we made our decision, we leave ourselves open for criticism, but it's a lot better to discuss the rationale of making a decision than the validity of the decision that you made. And finally, experts in the business will add depth to our understanding and provide opportunities for real audit value add. This is where we get the experts around us, especially for some of you younger people who are brilliant. And I love working with young people because you're much more mentally quick than my generation was, and you capture things much quickly. But we have a lot of expertise that we can share with you, and we would be willing and anxious to do that if you reach out and leverage some of those experiences. Our failures can help you be successful. And that's where I think that a lot of us of my generation and the generation right after me, we've had the opportunity to fail. You guys haven't had that opportunity yet. And maybe you can learn from our failures so you'll have different ones, or you'll have better ones so you'll learn even more better stuff, which is something really, really good. But remember, experts in the business will add depth to our understanding and provide opportunities for real audit value add. All right, I'm going to leave it open for questions and head it back to the host of this, and hopefully we have some questions. Want to leave my contact information. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I write some blogs. I do some articles on LinkedIn. We do webinars, all sorts of stuff. Love to share that with you. Love to learn from all of you guys. You have a lot of experience that can help me in what I do. So please connect. I'd like to thank my sponsor Galvanize for their great software company, for GRC and all of that good stuff. And Karim and Chentagan, I'll turn it back to you guys and maybe open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. It was great to listen you. I took lots of notes while listening you, and I hope our audience also having a great time by listening you and learn and learn from your experiences. Like you said, we need expertise to and create a synergy with the future. And we have questions.
Excellent.
Yes, Mr. Turhan has a couple of questions. Let's start with one of them. How does Agile Principle 1 also applies to traditional audit? Sorry, does not Agile Principle 1 also applies to traditional audit?
That's a good question. And actually, all of the principles apply to traditional audit. And the reason I say that is because traditional audit is becoming a little less traditional, if that makes any sense at all. It is a really good question, Turhan. I appreciate the question. What Agile principles do, and yes, the principle 1 maybe is more visual as the connectivity, but traditional auditing, if you follow the history of the Institute of Internal Audit, which is the biggest body of guidance that auditors have, if you follow their history, tradition has been modifying itself and evolving and maturing over the last few years. A lot of what Agile does, it just formalizes the theory that auditors have been discussing for a long period of time. And obviously, some things are going to be easier than other things in applying from a traditional perspective, because as traditionalists, we tend to be more comfortable making a slow growth change versus a rapid, really a quick overnight switch. The other 3 principles are more of that longer term change that is ongoing right now, and they all, when it all plays out in the wash and everybody is done making their mature modification evolving to the next level, they'll all be there. But you're absolutely right, the first principle does apply to traditional audit as well as to Agile, and that kind of shows us that we're not being radical, we're just being more modified in what we're doing. The other 3, I would say, apply to tradition as well, just differently. But that's a great observation. Thank you so much for sharing that and for asking the question.
So the questions are coming up as well. The other question of Mr. Turhan's, would Agile auditing take more time than the traditional auditing due to iterative planning and changes during the execution of auditing?
That's a great question, and I've had that only once before, and I've done this webinar for about maybe 10 or 15 times, but it's a great question. It does take more time to begin with, and it takes time because it is a thought process. The actual doing the audit, when I did traditional audit, once I learned the process, it didn't take me. It was a long process because I had to do X number of tests. I had to look at X number of samples. I had to document X number of papers. I had to write number of findings, et cetera, et cetera. All that took a long time. What Agile auditing does, it reduces the time of actual documentation and puts more of the time in, 1, thinking and planning, and communicating with your business partners. And those are the areas where you get real value. The value of audit, from my humble opinion, at least from what I learned when I was doing this, and I started as an auditor, if you will, before I became a chief audit executive after about 10 or 15 years. The real value to me was that communication with our clients and learning why they thought what they did was the right thing to do in their processes. Traditional audit didn't let me have that communication. I would do an interview, but I didn't have communication. I had an interview, and then I would go test what somebody told me. Communication is a sharing of ideas. It's a back and forth. It's an educative process that lets me learn and lets my client learn. And that's why I like the Agile process. It is a wonderful process that takes more time in planning, thinking things through. But once I've done that, I can do an audit. And I will give you an example. I had teams that used to do audits in 6 weeks. We could do the audit in field work in 4 weeks. We did the field work in 1 week or 2 weeks. We did the whole audit in 3 weeks. Once you get used to the process of Agile and thoughtful auditing, it makes it much more smooth, quicker, and easy. And the actual audit work itself, especially if you use data, and you do data retrievals and data analysis, etc., you can reduce your time and become much more effective. Therefore, you have more opportunity to look at other things and contribute more to your client. 2 great questions, Turhan. Thank you so much for asking them.
And the other one, it looks control of audit is more difficult in Agile auditing. How to enhance the control of Agile auditing?
Oh, I'm not sure I understand that question, so I'm going to try to answer from what I think the question is. Traditional auditing was really focused on controls. And we could get into a lot of conversations about control auditing. I'm not a big fan of control auditing, and I'll tell you why. In the United States, we had a financial crisis in 2017 and 2011. We had 2 of them. We did something called Sarbanes-Oxley, which is totally control-driven auditing, making sure the controls over financial reporting work. Of all of the banks that failed in those 2 financial crises, of all of the banks that failed during those 2 financial crises, 98% of them had great Sarbanes-Oxley audit results. They had good control audit results. So I question the traditional focus on just controls. And I question, so that's one reason why. The other reason I question controls, and these are radical, and you may not agree with me, and that's fine. The other one I question is because auditors rated controls fully effective, partially effective, ineffective. A control either works or it doesn't work. There's no partially effective. So we've already kind of screwed up our focus of control auditing by saying, well, okay, sometimes it can work and sometimes it can't. And I'm going to agree with that. No, a control works or doesn't work. Agile auditing does not minimize the effect of controls. What Agile auditing does, it allows us to be flexible in where we go to look at which controls are the most important controls and the most impactful ones that need to be looked at to be resolved. Rather than look at redundant process controls, we start looking at psychological controls, management controls, and higher level process controls, which typical traditional auditors do not look at, because traditional auditors are more process transaction level auditors than they are psychological, motivational, and profiling type of auditors. So there's a big gap in that. And that's why I'm going to disagree a little with the implication, but I hope I answered the question. Another good question, Turhan. Thank you.
Mr. Clark, we can change the question like how we can give assurance of our audit work. Actually, he has mentioned the control of audit work.
The control of audit work. Okay, yeah. The control of audit work, the control of audit work is always the planning. We have a planning document. So you have that. You document your work in your work papers, and then you track any issues that you have in your report, and you report to the audit committee. Agile doesn't change any of that. Agile principles actually allow you to focus more on why you make decisions in your audit process than the traditional audit does. We should have been doing that in traditional audit, and we always got criticized by people for not doing that. But Agile kind of requires us to document why we make decisions. So the controls in audit stay the same. As an audit manager or as a chief audit executive, you're still going to plan your audits, and you're going to have a planning document because you need to share that with the audit team. You need to share it with your clients. You're going to document your audit work. It may look different than it does in traditional audit work, but you are going to document all the work you do. You're going to document the decisions that you make. You're going to then document any exceptions that you found that were meaningful. You'll document them in your work papers, or you have the flexibility to put them in a report or a memo to management or some other way, and then you'll report those to the audit committee. So your documentation or controls over the audit process do not change. They just change perspective, and they modify to a more flexible, and you're using more tools, so obviously you have controls over those tools as well. I hope that answered it, Karim.
Yeah, and also Mr. Vargas has asked, how can I sell the idea with the owner process?
With the process owners.
Yeah.
I love that question, because you're thinking about what's the value to our client, not just the value to me. And I've always been a client first kind of auditor, in the concept of I want to provide value to my clients. So how can I sell the idea? And Freddie, that's a really good question. The best way I have found to sell the idea is to share with management a conversation that allows me to understand what is the value that they see in audit. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that pop out in my mind. If I'm talking to someone and they don't get there, I kind of help them get there. A traditional audit means I tend to interrupt you for a longer period of time. And sometimes I'm looking at things that don't mean a lot to you as a manager. I'm looking at processes that are fundamental and basic, the same things I look at year after year. I hear you when you tell me that I'm training my auditors by spending time with your people who should be focused with their clients, by learning the same thing I've looked at for the last 2 or 3 years. If I do Agile audit, what are the value to my clients? One, I get to look at things that are meaningful to them and their customers. I don't spend as much time understanding the fundamental basic processes because I already know those. I don't need to look at them again. I need to look at something new. I can provide consultative advice on things that I see. I don't have to criticize and put it in an audit report. So what I would do is I would list the benefits that I think are already there, and I would ask my client that I'm talking to, what are some additional benefits they would see with an Agile approach versus our traditional approach? And sometimes you start that conversation by saying, look, we want to modify our approach and get better. What did you not like about what we did, and what did you like about what we did? And start the conversation there and slowly drift to what the value is to your client versus what the value is to audit.
Exactly. The feedback is really important in our lives.
Absolutely.
The other question, Mrs. Ünal Hatice, she's asking, as an auditor, how can we add learning process in our professional life?
Could you repeat the question for me one more time?
Yeah. How can we add learning process in our professional life?
Ooh, I'm having a hard time understanding the context of that question.
Probably we can return later. Maybe she can add a little bit more information to the question box.
Okay.
Mr. Allen, what are the downsides of agile auditing, if any?
Well, there's always going to be downsides, and the downsides are the following. Right now, management has preconceived ideas of what audit should do and should not do, and regulators are the same. As with risk-based auditing, it takes a while for people to adjust to not looking at everything that they used to look at. And there's nothing wrong with that, Emir. A lot of leaders, CEOs, financial CFOs, other business leaders, governmental leaders, they get a sense of security when audit has done the traditional work, because it's something they don't need to look at. It's something they're very comfortable that audit has looked at, and they can rely on audit to do that. They tend not to be as comfortable when audit wants to get into areas that they typically have not looked at. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, auditors may not be as qualified as business people to look at that stuff. I don't agree with that argument, but that's an argument they give. It may be that they are not comfortable with their new strategies or some of those areas themselves, so they're not sure they can respond to us. I tend to agree with that one. They may be hiding something they don't want us to see. So if they keep us where they can have always kept us, we won't see some of that other stuff. I think that happens occasionally, but I don't think that's a big deal. But it tends to be more a comfort question. I used to rely on audit to do X, Y, and Z. Now they're starting to do something else. I don't know if I can still rely on that. And that's, if we can overcome those objections, it makes it a lot easier for us. So that's the downside, is lack of acceptance. And the second downside, which is always a potential, is we become too agile. And we don't look at some of the traditional controls occasionally, and we become too risk-based, so that we forget that we need to understand that basic controls still have to work. And there's ways to deal with that. And there's other webinars we do that talk about that. It's too long to go into here, but those are some of the downsides. We become too agile, forget that there are controls that need to be looked at by somebody, either the first or second line or the third line. And three, expectations from management and regulators may not allow us to be agile, so we become frustrated, and that makes it hard for us as well.
Thank you. So there is Mrs. Unal has rephrased her question. Her question is, as a manager, how can we add learning process in our professional life with agile approach?
Okay, thank you. I'll see if I can answer that question for you. There's a couple of things that, and I tend to be a little bit different in my learning. I think as a manager, as a chief audit executive, first thing you want to do, and I'm going to go a little bit more detailed on this for you to make sure that I answer the question. First thing you want to do is make sure that you allocate time in your annual plan for people on your staff to be trained, whether that is training, formal training, informal training, online training, virtual training, conferences, etc. You want to have that in there. What you really want to do, what I did was I looked at my training, and I doubled my training allotment for formal training time from 40 hours a year to 80 hours a year, which is 2 weeks of training. 40 of that was for being a better auditor, and other 40 hours was for understanding the businesses that I audited. So I wouldn't let them do 80 hours of just being an auditor, learning how to fill out work papers, do risk assessments, etc. 40 of it had to be with the business, understanding the business, etc. Those are two good things from the formal side. The value of training is the informal training. Where does that come from? The informal training comes by having your auditors look at something they are not familiar with looking at. It's having your auditors meet together after an audit and discuss what it was, what are their learnings from that audit, what did they learn from it? Not how did we do, but what did you learn from it? What were the connectivity points in it? What were some of the audit, some of the things that you weren't aware of when you went into the audit that you got out of it? That conversation that can last for 3 or 4 hours, if it's focused right, adds more value to our ability to learn than anything that I've seen formally. Another informal training technique is to have people from the business come to a lunch session and explain their business to you outside of an audit. If you're not auditing compliance in your unit, in your organization, have them come to lunch and explain what they do to everybody so that you're learning what they do. Education to me has always been the ability to learn from someone else. It's not sharing my opinion of what I know, but it's having them sharing their opinion of what they know. The more you can do that, the better it is. The informal opportunities are those tend to give more credence to an auditor and more value to an auditor. And that's where I would focus if I was going to do that. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, follow-up questions are great, and reach out to me and we can discuss this more.
Yep. So the next question is from Mr. Chetin. This is, in my humble opinion, the conflict that we have faced before the COVID-19. Is it possible to perform agile auditing in a traditional organization?
It is. I just wouldn't tell anybody about it. I know I'm joking. I used to do a lot of stuff in organizations, and once I did them, they ended up liking them. So what I would do, I mean, the end result is going to be the same. It's going to be the approach that you take. A traditional audit approach, you have a scope of an audit. In an Agile, you have a scope of an audit. It's just that you got to your scope differently. In a traditional audit, you have an audit universe. Okay, you're going to change your audit universe. You're going to elevate it. You're going to make it look different, but you're going to audit the same stuff. Traditional audit organizations are traditional for a reason. And the best way to get them to see what you do is not to explain everything to them at once. It's to give them a little bit here and a little bit there. And I don't say that because I want to be sneaky. It's because we can't eat the whole dinner if it's all on the table at the same time. If I have the salad, the main course, and the dessert on my table at the same time, I'm not going to eat all of that. But if I get my salad first and then my dinner and then my dessert, I tend to be able to eat it all. So it's the same way with the traditional audit unit. We want to share with them a little bit here and there. The first thing I would do with a traditional audit organization is I would change my universe and explain to them why I'm changing it. And I would start being more risk-based and start talking about risk management and why audit is going to be looking at things from a risk perspective, not ignoring the other things, but looking at new things and maybe things differently than we did before. And then I would show them the value of that in my first one. And the first thing I would do when I change a process, I never put a rating on it. It's always a consultative process. I'll give you one quick example. Went to an organization that never did data risk management. I said, you need to do data risk management. The regulators are going to hammer you in 2 years if you don't. Why don't you let me do a consultative review of data risk management, help your team get a baseline established, and then we can work for 2 years to make sure you're going to meet regulator expectations. They liked that approach because I didn't criticize them, I didn't audit them, and I prepared them for what was coming down the pipe. If you take that kind of approach in a traditional audit organization, you will have success. It's consultative, it's proactive, and it's preparing them for a positive result from clients, regulators, or stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you very much. And here's the last two questions. Cantik, we can hear you.
I have a question related with this question to Mr. Dan. Firstly, thank you so much for this great lesson. And as you know, Agile is a mindset, and the Agile methodology is a kind of project management process, and it requires maturity. And the question is, all auditors have to use Agile methodology? Because it can be dangerous if the organization don't have this maturity.
It was hard to hear the last part of that question, Chantin, because of the connection. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah. Agile is a mindset, as you know, you explained well, and Agile methodology is a kind of project management process, and it requires maturity. And the question is, are the all auditors have to use Agile methodology? If can be dangerous, maybe if the organization don't have the maturity.
Okay. I think I get. Okay. Yes. No. Yes. No. Auditors need to be, auditors cannot use a risk-based audit methodology or an agile methodology without defining what that looks like and getting buy-in from the organizations that they're going to work with. So there has to be a thoughtful process. It's not something you can just jump into. As I mentioned in the presentation, the definition of agile isn't really out there for auditors. We're defining that as we go. There's a lot of consultants and consulting companies out there selling processes with scrums and all sorts of terminologies that come from agile on the technology side. But if you look at it from the technology side and from an audit side, they're two different processes completely, and they have a different purpose in mind. And once you understand the purpose, then as auditors, you can adjust to agile audit methodology. And agile basically for auditors is to be flexible in the approach to what you do and flexible in your communication and the results of how you share the work that you've done. For auditors who are traditional, that's hard to do because we've been so ingrained of you have to do audit this way, ABC, ABC, ABC. Risk-based allows you to do ABC, ACB, CBA, and Agile allows you to do ABCD, ABCY, ABCL. So you're going to get there, but you're going to have to be trained. You're going to have to take a step by step, and you're going to have to be very cognizant of the fact that it is a process you're going to get to, not that it's something that you can just pull off the shelf and run with it. We do not have in audit the luxury of rolling something out and then changing it when we get feedback, because that's not what auditors do. We have standards. When we roll something out and write a report, we can't change the report after we've issued the report. So we have to be right. It's not like the agile technology process where you could be 50% right, then fix it and go 60%, fix the other problems and go 80%, and you've cut down your implementation time by 80%. I get that. Audit isn't that way. So it's more a perspective and education step than it is a process step, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, did that answer your question, Chantin or Chantikin?
Yeah, it was a great answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good question.
Chantikin, what do you say? Maybe one more question and then we can conclude.
Yeah, we can get one more.
Risk-based traditional audit is also agile audit for scoping what to audit. Mr. Turhan's another question. Risk-based traditional audit is also agile audit for scoping what to audit. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand that question completely.
Yeah, probably we can skip. It was, yeah, if we can add any information.
Maybe Mr. Turhan can revise the question.
Yeah,
if you
want. By the way, how do you see the future, Mr. Clark? That is what the importance with the COVID-19. We most of the auditors are working remotely and requires to be more agile than before. And we still have old issues in the old world, and now new world pushes us new question marks or the problems that we have to solve, and we have to give assurance on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's a great question, Karim. Here in the United States and in some of my friends in Latin America, working remotely is new to them. I worked remotely when I was at GE Capital for 2 years. I worked remotely at Citigroup. We traveled a lot, so we worked remotely. The interesting thing about the history of mankind is that there seems to be tools available to us when we have these pandemics and these crises. With technology today, there's no reason we should not be working remotely, and it should not be new to us. I think part of the traditional look is that auditors sit in the office, they go in there, they work, they look at what they do, and that's all part of the tradition of audit and is part of the mystique and the culture. And lately that culture was changing, and COVID-19 now has changed it dramatically. The things that are going to be important for us in the future from an audit perspective, one is going to be access to the right data, because we're going to have access remotely for data. And that means that the organizations are going to have to be having really good controls over data management. And so data management is going to be an emerging risk area, if it isn't already, for auditors to really focus in on. So that's one of the things. Working remotely and not having the face-to-face conversations means our communication skills are going to have to be enhanced for remote communication, for computer communication, for FaceTime communication, and back to telephone communication, not texting or emailing. Our audit process is going to have to spend more time communicating than testing. That's going to be really interesting because we spend more time testing traditionally than communicating. But when you do things remotely, you're going to have to communicate. So you're going to have different types of audit programs, and you're going to have to document more what's going on. Ultimately, we will go back to face-to-face auditing. We'll be back in the offices. We'll be doing those things. But a lot of what we're learning with the remote communication, presentation skills, not critical communication, but constructive, collaborative communication, that's the future of audit. And the last piece I'd add is we're going to rely more on first and second levels of defense that are out there that the business has already implemented. The more we can rely on that, the more that audit can contribute. You will probably see reduced audit staffs, but with better skills and better tools to do their jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Turhan rephrased his question, and
Okay.
I'm trying one more time. Therefore, when make risk assessment for audit scope, then it is like an agile audit when scoping audit. Traditional audit uses also risk-based audit. Therefore, when make risk assessment for audit scope, then it is like agile audit when scoping audit.
It's a good observation. I'm going to disagree with his observation. And Turhan, I don't like to disagree, but I'm going to give you another perspective for you to consider. What I have seen in traditional audit, the use of the risk assessment is not a risk-based risk assessment all the time. What it tends to be is a process level risk assessment or a transaction risk assessment. It's not an entity level risk assessment. And I'll give you an example of what I have seen. I'm not saying in your organization that's not what you do, but this is what I've seen traditionally in traditional organizations. An organization has its universe. They go to what they're going to audit, and they do a risk assessment of that process or that function. Unfortunately, that function is only one of many functions, and there are risks associated with what that function does or doesn't do that impacts the other functions of the organization. And organizations don't do a risk assessment at a high level. That's number one. So if you don't have, let's say there's a Bank of Turkey. If there's a Bank of Turkey, your risk assessments, I can almost guarantee you, if I go into the Bank of Turkey and I look at the audit team's risk assessment, they'll have a risk assessment for the audits they do, but they won't have a risk assessment for the Bank of Turkey. They'll have a risk assessment at functions within the Bank of Turkey. That the problem we have there is there are gaps between what the Bank of Turkey does, manages, and directs, and what the functions actually do with those directions. So that's one problem. Secondly, the risk assessment for a process is not a risk-based assessment from a true risk-based perspective, because not all processes are the same. So if you're doing the same processes every 2 or 3 years, your risk assessment will change, but it is a control risk assessment, not a risk assessment. So there's a functional difference there. Secondly, there are some inherent problems with risk assessments used for process and functional aspects that need to be addressed that aren't addressed yet. And the last point I'll make is a risk profile, which includes the motivation of why people do things, is a better tool than a risk assessment. So I get your point. I understand it. I'm just going to disagree with you respectfully. But again, a wonderful observation, and thank you for sharing that.
So thank you very much, Mr. Clark. It was a very, very fruitful webinar. We learned a lot.
That's great lesson for us.
Mr. Turhan also saying thanks to you from my private chat. And yeah, so John Tekin, would you like to say any last few words before we can conclude?
Yeah, definitely. It was a great lesson for us. I noted too much. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much for your kind support to us.
My pleasure. Thank you much. And please invite me back again. I enjoy talking about audit and risk-based auditing. If there's something I can do to help, please let me know.
I can smile more than this. Yeah, I can smile more than this while you are saying, please invite back again. And we will happy to have you again. Thank you very much.
Always.
Thank you. And thanks to all the participants for the great questions.
And for our users who is here right now, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. And you can follow us from our accounts. Thank you so much.